Hello, and welcome to the first in a series of lectures exploring the topic of data management with me, Dr. Jaimie Cross. You may not be aware of it, but you probably engage in quite a lot of data management as part of your daily routine in whatever field you happen to work. In that respect, you may be familiar with some of what follows in these lectures, but I hope there are aspects that are new to you, which perhaps provide you with some new skills to apply to your professional working environment. So here are the learning outcomes, and by the end of this first introductory lecture, you will be expected to explain what constitutes as data, recognize that it takes many forms. You'll also be able to define what data management is and why it is required. And finally, you will be able to recognize what is good data and what is bad data, and how operations are impacted by both. By way of introduction, for a course such as this, we need to consider some fairly fundamental questions. When we talk of data, what do we actually mean? And how are we supposed to manage it successfully? As you might expect, both subjects will be given great attention, not just in this lecture, but throughout the series. Incidentally, this lecture sets the scene for the remaining lectures of the series, so don't worry if you're keen to discover more on a given topic presented here. I'll highlight the places where a greater amount of detail can be expected at the appropriate points. But what we will look at here is our ability to spot when we are analysing good data and the occasions when we are not, which of course is of considerable importance when you need to rely on data to make informed operational decisions. Ultimately, this is our goal here. We need a new appreciation of the importance of data to our professional and perhaps personal lives. As we'll go on to look at, data should be considered as the most important commodity in your business. Very little can be achieved without it, but much can be lost should we not take the appropriate care in managing it. Moving on then to trying to define this term of data. Just as a point of note, you may not have known that the word data is plural, not singular. Watch out for this in scientific writing, where you will see sentences written such as the data are good as opposed to the data is good. When in conversation, it is commonplace to speak of data in the singular form. I've done it already in this lecture. And as language evolves, this is acceptable, but you will likely be corrected when writing about data if you do not use the plural form. And speaking of modern times, as you're no doubt aware, we have experienced something of an explosion in the growth of technology in recent times. Data, then, surrounds almost every activity. But what exactly are data? Well, you may have heard of the term bit and byte. A bit is the fundamental unit of data and contains two pieces of information. For example, yes and no. A byte consists of 8 bits, so now we are talking about a total of 256 pieces of information, as 2 to the power of 8 equals 256. A short sentence or paragraph might equate to this, and you can see this for yourselves. Perhaps type some text into a text editor and see how the size of the file changes with the amount of text that you're including within it. We'll look further at the other various terms used to describe data later in the course, but essentially you'll have encountered the doubtless familiar prefixes of kilo, mega, giga, etc. before byte throughout your daily activities. Now, having said this, we shouldn't forget that paper records are equally valuable and just as valid in terms of any description of data. Many aspects of operational activities are still reliant on the humble piece of paper and pen, particularly when it comes to recording the context within which data are collected and why, which is also known as metadata, and we'll look more closely at that shortly. In essence, the management of all manner of data is probably something we undertake as part of our daily lives, from personal banking to filling out forms to access local services. What we are trying to do here is to become more aware of the importance of data management, with the goal of maximising the efficiency and accuracy of the systems used to collect, store, and analyse it. So, are all data good data? Sadly not. We need to discriminate between what constitutes good data and bad, and this really depends on what our final goal for that data is. Data accuracy is something of a movable feast, and a compromise can often be made between quality and efficiency. This may seem a little counterintuitive, as you might think that every effort should be made to make all data as accurate as possible. This is not the case for much instrumentation. For example, instruments that record the level of the tide or measure currents can have variable settings that trade off power demand against the number of measurements made for a given period of time. The collection of data can also impact on quality. Instrumentation is one aspect, but when that data is recorded manually, problems can often occur. A typical example of this at sea can be observations of marine mammals. As skilled as the observers may be, they frequently have to endure long shifts, and tiredness is often a problem. It's not uncommon under these conditions for periods of an individual watch to be removed or discounted due to this unreliability. And very much data are freely available and open source. As useful as this is, we cannot always be certain as to the reliability of this data, nor that it was collected appropriately. Due care must be taken even if the metadata appears to be rock solid. And ultimately, our ability to analyse the data efficiently may drive a further compromise over quality. As much as we would like all of our data to be of the highest quality all of the time, as long as we're transparent, that is, honest about how it was collected and processed, allowing any end user to make an educated assessment of their own, then this will largely be sufficient. But of course, it really will depend on the specific circumstances of the situation with which you are faced. Often, the true picture of data quality will not materialise until all of what is termed the post-processing is complete, and you begin to analyse the signals of interest a little more closely. Perhaps only then will you determine that the collected data can help inform that operational decision. Careful inspection of the results of your efforts is required here. Wisdom is required, too, to ensure that results are not over-interpreted. For example, this image happens to be some current speed data for a location in the Western English Channel. Those of you with keen eyes will see that it is for a very specific period of time. What we cannot do is over-interpret this data and say that it applies to the whole of the English Channel all of the time. Now, post-processing generally refers to the stage of data analysis that follows the treatment of raw data. It is the time when you get that clearer picture and truly understand what is going on for whatever situation you set out to study. Data such as these displayed here are insufficient to describe long-term activity at this or any location, but they still might be able to validate a model of current speed here, perhaps contributing to an enhanced ability to forecast conditions or helping to determine some other important process locally. The key point is to use your judgment wisely and question all aspects of what is being shown, rather than being distracted by what might otherwise appear to be solidly reliable. But as far as the collection of data goes, more does not necessarily mean better. Often, our instinct is to simply acquire as much information as possible. But there is a balance to be struck between the volume of data collected and the available resources to process and analyse it. Of course, this depends on what your particular goal is, but should you have automated systems that process the data without further effort, then perhaps more is better. For example, if I were to conduct an analysis of tidal currents in a particular location, perhaps in order to refine a model to predict future current speed, then more really is better. The increased level of detail, or further back in history your measurements take you, will always help in this situation. But sometimes there is a need to interpret the results of the data in a specific way. Perhaps you're seeking to establish the most efficient way in which ships enter and leave port. It is unlikely that a fully automated system could manage this without some specific guidance or input from a user that appreciates the context within which the computer arrives at its decision. In short, we need to think about managing the flow of information, which would hopefully be made clear in the planning process for the data collection itself. Now, as you might expect, the management of large quantities of data can be a full-time occupation. From the perspective of the UK ocean scientist, this role falls to a publicly funded body called the British Oceanographic Data Centre, or BODC. We'll look more closely at BODC later in the course, as they are such a good example of best practice in data management, and they employ a large number of qualified experts to ensure data is stored correctly, with all of the necessary mechanisms put in place to ensure it is made available for users in the future. Now let's turn to a topic I've mentioned already here, but I'm yet to define properly: metadata. We need to consider that any data we acquire may not be used immediately, nor even for the intended purpose for which it was collected. And a significant period of time might elapse between collection and use. This is where metadata comes in, and strictly is the first and most important step in good data management. Metadata gives that all-important context to the circumstances within which the original data were collected. Without it, future users of the data are blind and cannot apply any new thinking to old data if it is missing this all-important component. So metadata is indeed critical. We'll return to this subject in the next lecture and examine metadata more closely, but for the moment it is enough to say that small details surrounding the collection of the data can be incredibly important. As this image suggests, metadata is truly a love note to future users, as we cannot know in advance how others may want to use the data in the years that follow. Metadata can be anything related to the acquisition of the data, including simple things such as the date of collection, the positional coordinates, weather conditions, the time of sampling, instrument settings, and so on. To be on the safe side, report all of these things and more besides. The next user of the data will love you right back for it. So, assuming we have done a great job of collecting the data, recording the appropriate metadata, and made a start on the analysis, what do we do about data storage? It is indeed more complex than you might think. And whilst options are plentiful, the solution must be appropriate for the needs of the sector within which you work. Can we afford to operate a large data warehouse? Do we have the resources required? Do we need to access the data instantly from anywhere on the planet? If so, then perhaps cloud computing might help with this and all other issues. But what if we work offshore and we require a stable connection with a lot of bandwidth? Clearly, there is no one-size-fits-all solution, but there are plenty of options for us here, so again we will return to this topic later in the series. One thing that we should be doing daily is backing up our data. This includes personal and professional data. In my line of work as a research scientist, it is not uncommon to run several backups a day, as considerable effort can be expended finding solutions to problems that it would be inefficient in the extreme to repeat. Security, of course, is equally important, particularly if you are working in commercially sensitive environments or are having to process data that is protected by legislation of any kind. Now, we need to remember that the goal in all of this is to effectively manage our data to better inform our operational decision making. If it sounds like there is a lot to think about here, it's because there is. We all work in complex sectors of what is a heavily data-influenced industry. And if we hope to successfully negotiate complex scenarios, then this subject cannot be overlooked nor underestimated. Ultimately, to better understand all aspects of the environment within which you work, successful data management is critical. There are other benefits associated with best practice, of course, in that those who are highly skilled in this area are in high demand. There is a global shortage of individuals with deep analytical data processing and management skills. A report from the McKinsey Global Institute recently suggested that the global shortage of data-aware managers was in the region of 1.5 million. So there's no excuse then to not give this aspect of your studies the fullest attention. Finally then, for this shorter introductory lecture in this series, we come to the issue of who is to take responsibility for ensuring that best practice in data management is followed. Well, frankly, it is up to all of us to ensure that these basic steps are followed. We can't just leave it to others and assume that all of our valuable data has been correctly stored, processed, and all of the metadata correctly written up and attached to the raw data. We must begin to appreciate that data is an important and valuable commodity that could influence whether we and the organisations we represent are successful. While some of this means self-evident, I'm sure we have all encountered more than one occasion when either we or someone we know has endured unnecessary data pain as a result of not following what may seem, at least superficially, to be good old-fashioned common sense. I can certainly recall more than one student who has failed to submit their coursework on time because they had a problem relating to their project data. The buck really should stop with us. Recognise the importance of good data management, implement some of its suggestions into the way in which you work with data, and you will reap the benefits for the rest of your career. So, we've now reached the end of this first lecture and we can review the learning outcomes that were stated at the beginning. And by now you should be able to explain what constitutes as data, recognising that it takes many forms. You should be able to define what data management is and why it is required. And hopefully you should now be able to recognise what are good data and what are bad data, and how operations might be impacted by both. So I hope you enjoyed this short introduction to data management. Thanks for your attention, and you'll hear from me again in the next lecture in the series. Cheerio!